Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the best-selling author Barry Eisler, ex-CIA, ex-lawyer, the author of many thriller novels that are, in fact, I only found out today, favorites of Elizabeth Warren, which is interesting. And most recently, the new novel, The System. Barry Eisler, you might remember, has been written about in Current Affairs magazine in an article called The Politics of Thrillers, which discussed the kind of right-wing assumptions underlying a great number of popular thrillers, and said that the politics of thrillers are often terrible, but drew a major exception for my guest today, Barry Eisler, and said his novels are great. So Barry Eisler, welcome to Current Affairs.
Thank you, Nathan. It's nice to be here, and thank you for that nice introduction.
Your new novel has blurbs from some great people, including friends of the magazine like Arno Bertrand and Ryan Grimm, who are kind of unusual people to blurb a political thriller. And but the thing about this novel is, and what's so cool about this novel is that this isn't just a story, a piece of entertainment. This is a piece of almost sociology. This is like if Noam Chomsky was in your line of work. like
If you're trying to make my day, it's working.
yeah. Well, it's so cool because you're not just, as I say, you're not just telling a gripping story and there's sex and violence in the story, there's plenty to entertain people. But what you're also doing, I mean, the novel is called The System, and you're really trying to show people in kind of a realistic way how power works, or at least that's how I
Yes.
interpret what you're doing here. But maybe since you're here, you could tell me what your interpretation of what you're doing here is.
That is exactly what I'm trying to do. That is the foundation of the book, is how power is really exercised in America. And as you said, of course, if it's not entertaining, then I haven't done my job. Then I shouldn't write a novel. I'll write a blog post or something like that. So I hope that people will find the story of Valeria Velez, who at the beginning of the book has just been elected to represent California's 27th district as the youngest woman in Congress. I hope people will find her story super compelling. Just can't stop turning the
Hmm.
pages. Again, if I haven't done that, then I haven't done my job as a novelist. But what I really hope is that when people finish the book, they'll come away with, if not a different understanding of how power is actually exercised in America, by whom and for whom, then at least I hope they'll be more open to a different way of seeing how power is really exercised in America. I think we ordinary people are heavily propagandized. I don't even think that's disputable, but we're heavily propagandized in a lot of different ways. And one of those ways, one of the consequential ways we're propagandized, is into thinking that there are actually two political parties in America that represent quite different choices, and we can choose whichever one we want. Power is mostly vested in the government, and then we have these very different parties we can choose between depending on our own preferences. And I think that's absolutely a fiction.
Hmm.
If you were to do a Venn diagram of all the most consequential issues that might be addressed in a society or by the government, and one would represent the Democratic wing and the other would represent the Republican wing, if you do those two Venn diagrams, you'll see almost total overlap. There will be some important differences, very few. For example, on matters like abortion. Yes, that's a quite important and consequential difference between the two wings of the party, no doubt. But there are so many other issues that are
Hmm.
extremely consequential. I could go on and on about them. Just
Hmm.
how income is distributed in a society. How much money do we need to pump into the military, which is euphemistically called defense, propagandistically called defense, and on and on and on. So really,
Hmm.
these two things that call themselves parties, I think of more as two wings of the same party. Don't take my word for it. Anybody who's resisting this notion, it was Obama himself who said that
Hmm.
politics in America is
Yeah.
played between the 40-yard lines.
Yeah.
So this is what I don't make any of these points explicitly in the novel. I don't want to hit anyone over the head. I want you to be entertained. But as you see the way power is really exercised and
Hmm.
by and for whom, hopefully at the end of the book you'll be open to a slightly different point of view, and maybe you'll have a good conversation with someone else who's read the system and try to decide what does it all mean.
Well, the guest on the program just before you was Ralph Nader, who made a very similar, whose analysis of the two-party system is very similar, who has always emphasized the degree of overlap between the two.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so our listeners will be this won't be too unfamiliar to our listeners, but I think one of the it's interesting to think why this isn't obvious. And one of the reasons it's not obvious is because the conflict between the parties they are meaningful, right? So right now there's this showdown on immigration, right? There's
Right.
Newsom versus Trump, and so if people open their the pages of their newspaper, they're
Right.
going to see a standoff between the Republican president who's trying to enact a mass deportation program and a Democratic governor. But what you're saying there is what you're not seeing is the degree to which the two circles of the Venn diagram on so many other things that
That's
go
right.
undiscussed, the things that you're not seeing, that you're not talking about. These are the reason that these aren't in the newspaper is because the circles of the Venn diagram overlap. So there's nothing to discuss. There's no conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, why would it won't get reported? It's not nearly as interesting. I think it was Banksy who's at least supposed to have said, if you want to get attention, pick a fight.
Mm,
Because if there's no fight, people tend not to pay attention. I can give you
mm,
an interesting example of this. Some years ago, I wrote an article for your alma mater, The Guardian.
mm,
There's an interesting story there having to do with Israel and U.S. government support for the government of Israel, which we'll probably also wind up talking about, or certainly we could. This was around the time where John Brennan's CIA hacked into the computers of Senator Dianne Feinstein's people who were investigating CIA torture activities during the so-called War on Terror. And I was struck by the following. Dianne Feinstein was extremely angry when she learned that the CIA was hacking into the computers of her staff, her committee that was investigating torture. Well, you would expect her to be angry. I was angry too. And she made a speech where she listed her grievances, and they were quite serious. That was a violation of Executive Order 10333. I think that was the number of the executive order. It was a violation of the separation of powers. It was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, very serious allegations.
mm,
And as I listened to the speech, I was like, oh, she's really throwing down. I wonder what sort of punishment or redress or whatever is she going to call for? And her conclusion was, and therefore, I demand an apology.
mm,
And I was struck by that. What does
mm,
that mean? These are crimes you've just uh, articulated and accused John Brennan and the CIA of committing, quite serious crimes, and you're demanding an apology. So the article that I wrote was essentially, it was almost a precursor, although I didn't realize it at the
mm,
time, for the sorts of themes I'm dealing with in the new novel, The System, and how I compared the behavior of Dianne Feinstein, John Brennan, and our other rulers to something that I remember from The Godfather, the book and the movie, where Michael initially suggests that, okay, I know how to deal with this problem we're having, where our enemy is being protected by a New York police captain. We'll kill the police captain. And the family consigliere, Tom Hagen, says, Michael, we can't kill a police captain. The Corleone family would be outcast. What he's saying essentially is that that would be going too far. That would be a
mm,
violation of the rules, and the rest of the system of which we are a part would turn against us if we did that. And Dianne Feinstein, it was clear to me, had a similar notion. I'm sure none of these people think
mm,
of themselves as crime families, although I think it's useful to use the crime
mm,
as a rubric for understanding the way our rulers operate. But she did recognize that if she went too far, it would create a problem with her, with other players, other families within the system of which she
mm,
is a part, was a part, and where her power was derived from. So instead, she fired the equivalent of a shot across the bow. What she said is, hey, you other families, either you straighten this guy out and get him to back off because he's overstepped, or I will start creating real problems. And then what
Mm,
happened is other players within the system, they went to John Brennan and they said, John, we know she can get a little crazy, but you got to admit you overstepped a little bit.
mm,
They had to sit down. You got to
mm,
apologize. All she's asking for is apology. All right, you got to back off, and then we can get back to business. And
mm,
that's how this was handled. So I never forgot that. And as I said, it became the
mm.
basis in some ways for the current novel. This is a better way of understanding how our system really operates. There are implicit rules. Fights start to break out, but they're settled in, the biggest ones are settled internally so
Mm.
that the system can get back to the business of ruling.
You famously do a hell of a lot of research for your novels, and you're one of the only novelists whose stories contain endnotes, sources, right? Even though this is fiction, there are sources, and also you have this wonderful page on your site where you correct mistakes. People write in and go, in this city, if you're looking at this building, you're not
Yeah,
facing the southwest, you're facing the southeast, and you're like, well, I'll go change it.
exactly
Wait,
right.
you strive
Yeah,
for as much accuracy as you can get, given that you're telling a fictional story. And so, presumably, one of the things you had to do in this book is work out for yourself. I mean, to the extent that there were gaps in your perceived knowledge of how Washington actually works. What are the things that are just cliches and versus what would reality actually be like in this situation? And I think in so doing, some of the
yeah,
conclusions that you've come to and the world of the book is going to surprise some people
yeah.
who might share your politics, but not quite have reached that understanding of how this probably really works in the world. And what I mean, let me just give a specific there. Like,
Please.
so if people expect that the powerful are going to be sinister
Yeah,
behind the scenes, one of the things that might come as a surprise that throughout the novel is that behind the scenes there's such cordiality that people don't necessarily, scream and curse and shout at you. And I think that one
yeah.
of the things that your protagonist, Velez, is sort of surprised by is there are a couple of moments where she's like, wait, you're not mad. You're like, you seem weirdly friendly.
Yeah,
All of this is all smiles. Like behind, it's
yeah,
not like there are smiles in
yeah.
public and then behind the scenes, everyone is really nasty. That's not how it works.
No, no. And in fact, one of the epigraphs, there are 63 chapters in the books and in the book, and each one is introduced by an
Yeah, these
epigraph. And
great
then there's
quotes you
the,
have.
I love this stuff. And you could tell I didn't go out and search for this. I'd just been collecting them for years because I like them. And then at some point I thought, oh, look, I can actually use an epigraph for each chapter in the book. One of them is from former Congressman Justin Amash. And I don't remember it verbatim, but what he said is you see fighting of the kind we've been talking about. But it's kabuki fighting, it's
Mm,
theatrics. He said when they turn off the cameras, these people are all friends. They put their arms around
mm,
us. They understand. It's a show.
mm,
It's just a show. It's like pro wrestling or
mm,
something like that. And in fact, that's a separate topic. I think part of Trump's success is recognizing that politics is a kind of show business
mm,
akin to professional wrestling, where it's not real. I think the word is kayfabe, where you pretend there's a
mm,
heel, there's a hero, and people get caught up in this stuff, but none of it is real. None of it is genuinely felt. So, yes, that's one of the things I try to depict in the book. It seems like these are cage matches, death matches, but fundamentally, these people are cooperating. Their areas of cooperation are vast, and their areas of actual conflict are very narrow. It's just that again, we tend to focus on conflict fighting. We notice it more where there's that bipartisan consensus on, for example, how much do we need to spend on the military? And this is the
mm,
difference will be, should it be $950 billion this year? Or should we make it an even trillion? That's not a real difference when you
mm,
consider all the other actual possibilities out there. It's not like how
mm,
do you narrow choice? So this is Noam Chomsky. This is manufacturing consent.
mm,
How do you narrow choice to a degree that it doesn't even really matter anymore, and yet people think it's a real choice? That's how
mm.
I think of, again, what I don't like to call these things two parties. I think they're better understood as two wings of the same party, the duopoly. I think that's just a better way to understand at least partisan politics in America. And then how is power actually really exercised? That's a much broader question having to
Mm.
do with Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the Pentagon, what's often called the
Mm.
military industrial complex, the energy sector, the media, things like that. This is where power really lies in America, not so much with the politicians.
Because, like I said, clearly you've thought a lot it becomes evident in reading this novel about, okay, but how does it actually work, right? It's
Right.
not that someone comes to you with a briefcase full of $100 bills and hands it to you, and then the congressperson takes the, briefcase and votes for the bill.
Yeah.
And in order to explore that dynamic, you have you've built the story of someone who, like, not to diminish the size of your capacious imagination, but I think
No,
that
no.
as soon as people read the basic facts of the story of Valeria
Yeah.
Velez, they're going to get a little ring of familiarity because, I
Yeah.
mean, they clearly, to some degree, based on the story of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to the point
Sure.
where she's a Latina, she's a bartender, she goes there to try and change the system, and she's like 30 years old.
Yeah.
So tell me what it is about that kind of story, the story that you see in AOC, that you felt that like that kind of story about that kind of character going to Congress could illuminate some important things about how this system worked.
Yeah. I should start by saying when I do interviews like this, when I talk about the politics of the book in public, I'm
Hmm.
always a little shy about pointing to actual individual. I'm going to. I
Hmm.
just want to tell you why I'm a little shy about talking
Yeah.
about actual people, because we're just wired in such a way that we're innately tribal,
Hmm.
and we cathect to humans in a
Hmm.
way that it's not necessarily helpful. So if Alexandria, if Ocasio-Cortez is your lover or your hater,
Hmm.
then immediately whatever I have to
Sure.
say, it's going to light up your amygdala if you don't agree, and you're
Yeah,
going to get a
yeah.
defensive reaction. And I'm not interested in that. I mean, I'm trying to persuade, or at least to get people to be open to another way of looking at things.
Sure.
I'm not trying to put anybody down, anybody's beliefs down. I could be wrong about just about anything, but I will. That all that said, AOC I find very interesting.
Hmm.
I first encountered her because Glenn Greenwald interviewed her
Hmm.
on his show. I forget what his show was. Maybe it was still called System Update. It was when he was with The Intercept. He learned about AOC because Ryan Grimm
Hmm.
had, I don't know how Ryan, had she come to Ryan's attention. I mean, Ryan was The Intercept's Washington bureau chief. So he just knew about what's going on in DC. And he recommended to Glenn, he said, I think you want to interview this person. She's quite
Hmm.
interesting. And she's taken on Joe Crowley, a 10-term corporatist incumbent. Nobody thinks she has a shot, but
Hmm.
I know a little bit about her and I found her quite interesting. So Glenn interviewed her. And I followed Ryan at The Intercept. I followed Glenn. So I watched his interview of AOC, and I have to admit, I was really impressed.
Yeah.
She was
Oh, I mean,
smart.
she's the best speaker I've ever seen live, by the way.
Yeah,
When
sometimes
I mean,
I think she sometimes overdoes what I'd call the code switching a little bit, but that might be personal preference. Yeah,
but
she's
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 very, very talented.
totally agree. A natural, especially her
Yeah.
social media game. I mean, it's next level. She's
Yeah.
great. She's obviously uh, a remarkably talented person. She's smart and smart, articulate, charismatic. Again, some people, if you don't like her, you don't like her. These are
Hmm.
just idiosyncratic reactions. It doesn't really matter. But again, I was impressed. I was impressed by what she was saying and the sorts of values that she seemed to have. And this happens to me every time I start believing in a politician. When am I going to figure it out? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was like, wow, this is great. I'm really impressed. Um, so subsequently, following her trajectory from rebel, firebrand, outsider, bane of Nancy Pelosi and all that,
Hmm.
to Democratic insider. And I think it was the New York Times who described the progression this way in flattering terms. They're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
she's too
She's
much of a
learned.
firebrand. Right, exactly, exactly. What you could read is she's been tamed, she's been gentled, she's
Yeah.
part of the system now. And you could argue, I mean, if I were writing a story, the nonfiction story of like, what is the apotheosis, or call it the nadir of AOC's political trajectory, I would identify it as being last summer's speech at the DNC,
Hmm.
where she claimed that Kamala Harris was working tirelessly to achieve a ceasefire
Yeah.
between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
In Kamala Harris, we have a chance to elect a president who is for the middle class because she is from the middle class. She understands the urgency of rent checks and groceries and prescriptions. She is as committed to our reproductive and civil rights as she is to taking on corporate greed. And she is working tirelessly to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and bringing hostages home.
I remember wondering at that point, how do you cauterize your soul sufficiently to be able to say something like that?
Yeah.
It's quite a thing. And she went to that position from early on, making the political mistake of saying, look, I don't have that much to say about Israel and Hamas. Like, she was somewhat critical of the Israeli government, which is always refreshing in American politics. But she said, it's not something I know that much about, so I'm a little reluctant. I actually always admire people who say, well, my opinion on this isn't that strong because I don't know that much about it. That seems quite reasonable to me. Anyway, so on balance, I would say she's been something of a disappointment. I don't want to overstate. I think it's foolish to put too much hope in any politician, but I have thought a lot about what happens to someone like her, and I try to depict this in the book with regard to Valeria Velez's journey through power in America, and I could see where it starts. If you think about it, I want to give AOC her due. Different as a novelist, this is just my interpretation. I'm not psychic, and I could be wrong, and other people might not agree. But I think she probably did start with genuinely held convictions. She wanted to get in politics to achieve her genuine ideals. Whether you agree with those ideals or not isn't material to the point. And what she discovered early on is that once you're in the system, if you want to get anything done, you have to find a way to use the system, to wield the levers of power available in the system. And this is going to require compromise. And the more power you want to accrue, the more compromise you're going to have to put up with. And at some point, the rationalizations will pile up to a degree that you might have lost sight of your ideals entirely. And to move this into the fictional realm, in the very first chapter, Victory Party in Lancaster, California, California's 27th district, where all odds she has just defeated her 10-term corporatist incumbent, Phillian Dunn. And so it's a big party. But within minutes, what she learns is that the Pentagon is moving the Next Generation Air Dominance fighter jet program out of her district, Palmdale. This is where Air Force Plant 42 is located. They're moving the program to Fort Worth, which happens all the time. This thing with Valeria's constituents out of work overnight. Valeria ran on a campaign of we're going to stop stuffing the maw of the military machine, implement a universal basic income, and return power to the people. Immediately, the Pentagon's like, all right, good luck with all that. We're going to put 5,000 of your constituents out of work. See how you like us now. And she recognizes immediately that if she lets this happen, she's only going to be a one-term congresswoman. If she doesn't fight for those jobs, then those 5,000 constituents won't just not vote for her next time. They'll campaign against her. They'll vote for her opponent. She'll never be reelected if she lets this happen. So what do you do in a situation like this? The rationalizations are they're right there for you.
Yeah.
What is she get? Not only will she not be able to get anything done in Congress as a one-term congresswoman, she'll be an object lesson for what happens if you take on the military-industrial complex. She'll have been worse than useless. So the rationalizations start kicking in. Now imagine 10 years of rationalizations like that. As you get closer and closer to the next rung of power, what's going to be left of you at the end? And this is a question that interests me on a human level. And really, it's the human level that makes novels work. If you don't have that, then you should write something else. What happens to a person as that person interacts the way Valeria Velez is interacting with power? So as far as AOC goes, what I would say is, if you love AOC or you hate her, don't worry. This isn't a novel about AOC. Certainly the character was inspired by AOC, but that's where the similarities end.
But no, I think what you're talking about. So AOC's trajectory, I think, is, as you say, deeply fascinating. And separating ourselves from, you could tell two stories. One story is the sympathetic story, which says,
Right.
okay, this is someone who is actually learning how the system works and how to operate effectively within it, which is the
Right.
story, as you say, that the New York Times told. And then you can tell the story of that a progressive supporter of AOC might have, which is this is the co-optation
Yeah.
process that occurs. And you cite in your endnotes Ryan Grimm's wonderful book
Yeah.
on the squad, and you know he got kind of the inside story here, and
Yeah.
it is in fact the case that as soon as she gets into power, she comes in with this staff that's very confrontational, and they're all
Right.
ready to take on Pelosi, and she does this occupation. She joins the Sunrise Movement, their
Right.
occupation of Pelosi's office, and then it rapidly becomes clear that Nancy Pelosi has a lot of power, and that if
Yes.
you start tangling with Nancy Pelosi and the leading Democrats, they will just ensure that you get nothing. That
Yes.
you are never the head of a committee,
Yes.
that you never get to pass any legislation. If you piss them off too much, they will fund your next primary opponent, and you will be out of office. And AOC has this moment where she purges her staff of some of the more confrontational people who are picking fights with the Democratic leadership. And
Right.
you mentioned that moment at the DNC, which is, as you say, I agree, a real low point because it's an outright lie. They weren't actually trying to facilitate a ceasefire. They were funding, they were in fact blocking a ceasefire at the UN, vetoing it repeatedly, and Kamala Harris seemed fine with that. And then AOC and Bernie Sanders were two of the last holdouts in support of Biden when it was very, very clear that Biden wasn't a viable candidate. And the reason for that was that they had seen how power works, which is they thought to themselves, well, if Biden's not going to go, we want to be the people who stuck by him, and then he's going to be in debt to the progressive wing of the party from sticking by him. Now, in the event he was ultimately forced out, so that gamble didn't pay off, but you can see how the gamble worked. And so, but what you're doing here is you are, as you say, setting aside one's judgment about that process. You are trying to understand that process.
Exactly.
It is not that someone comes in and they instantly shed their principles. It is not that someone comes in and they are bribed or their idealism evaporates overnight. It is a process, and what you're doing here is a work of like political sociology.
Yeah, thank you. That's a nice way to put it. It's a nice compliment, and I think that's a perfect description. Again, as a novelist, the thing that interests me most is the human experience. What makes us human? What makes our lives have meaning or not have meaning? What is life itself to humans? That's all the stuff that interests me most. I also am, and anybody can look at
To
my
the
epigraphs.
humans, as one of your characters might say.
Thanks for saying that. It's funny because I do that myself. I like to refer to them as the humans because it gives me some distance, which I think, and this is another Chomsky thing, like looking at America the way a Martian would look at America.
Chomsky, I thought of Chomsky's Martian when Monty was speaking.
This is where all this, it's funny. One of the lovely things about being a novelist is what gets caught in the weird filter of your brain, because all the time there's just something that catches in there. The Martian thing is a super useful, I guess you could call it a thought experiment or a framework that everybody should use. You don't have to be a novelist or anything like that. I try very hard to do this. Am I successful? Who can say for sure? But in fact, I once wrote an article for Boing Boing where I had a conversation with a Martian, and I was trying to explain to the Martian why American violence is good. Why this is what you and Noam Chomsky did at length in your book, the myth of American. Idealism in foreign policy? It's a myth, but it's if you're in it, if you're American, if this is your tribe, if you're in the in group, it's very hard to step outside this thing. And I would just mention for anybody who's interested, one of the best frameworks I've ever come across for understanding the humans is something called the fundamental attribution error. You can Google it if you don't know what it is, but basically it's this. The fundamental attribution error is the notion that when I do something good, it's because I'm a good person. I'm innately good. I have good character. And if I do something bad, it was a mistake or a screw up or whatever, but no reflection on my innate character. But the opposite framework gets applied to other people I don't like, out-group people. If an out-group person I don't like does something good, then I attribute it as, well, he must have done it for bad reasons. He's still a bad person. I'll acknowledge there might have been some good that came out of this one act, but he's still a bad person who is probably acting for bad reasons. And if the bad person, the person I don't like, does a bad thing, then I say, see, I told you so. It's a bad person. So you could say we judge ourselves by our good intentions, no matter what we do, and we judge others by their bad intent. People we don't like, we judge them by their bad intentions, no matter what they do. And to get out of this, you got to think about how would a Martian see this. So I was talking to this Martian for the article in Boing Boing and saying, ISIS is terrible, just as one example. I'm like, they burn people alive. I mean, this is sick. It's barbaric. And the Martian was saying, but did you Americans yourselves not invent napalm? Napalm, which means sodium palmitrate. You mix gasoline with a substance that turns it into a jelly, and it clings to human skin and causes horrific burns. And I was like, well, but that was a long time ago. I mean, that was Vietnam. It's napalm. And then the Martian says, but do you Americans yourselves not have a missile that you call a hellfire missile? You've actually named it to celebrate its burning effect, its fire, and you call it is a thermobaric weapon. Thermo is the Greek for heat, and baric meaning pressure. It produces a heat wave, of pressure wave of such intensity that it peels the skin off humans, even the ones it doesn't blow to bits. And you celebrate this effect by calling it a hellfire missile. And I was like, the Martian was really beginning to stymie me. So if you want to see your own culture, your own in-group a little more clearly, you have to think, you have to set yourself outside your own culture's framework, or else you'll never be able to see things accurately. So that's Monty Cranston, my spinmeister savant, who refers to humans as the humans. And as he
he's
puts
like
it,
Dark Chomsky. He's like if Chomsky had gone into PR to do manufacturing consent, because he knows how to do manufacturing consent.
he understands these things deeply.
Yeah.
And he's somewhat amoral in the sense that he just knows how things work. At one point, he's even thinking to himself, he doesn't really understand individual humans, but he understands the humans. And as he puts it, he doesn't see trees very well, but he can see forests. And thinks to himself, he knows how it operates and how you manipulate the operating system with language, for example. He acts as a kind of Greek chorus where, for both insight and humor, and also to advance the plot, he'll point out something that's really going on in the story. And I mean, it's just one example. He's talking about how he told the Pentagon, don't call it the Next Generation Air Dominance Program. They didn't listen to him. He said, call it the Next Generation Air Defense Program. Defense is a good word. It's why they renamed the War Department, the Defense Department in 1947. Who can quarrel with defense? We all need to defend ourselves. War is a bit of a different matter. So he said, dominance isn't good. People don't really like dominance. And in fact, if you listen to our leaders and read Raytheon brochures and stuff, dominance is just a huge part of our culture, at least today. I had to stop because I don't want the footnotes to be taken over, to be dominated by examples of the use of domination in our culture. But it is fascinating how prevalent this notion is that we need to dominate other countries and dominate the world, dominate the battle space, all these things that we need to dominate. If the Chinese ever talked about domination and dominating the way we do, we would completely freak out. And by the way, this is a quick example of what I'm talking about. We have to think like a Martian. You have to get outside your own skin because we don't really think anything of this. We're like, yeah, domination, it's all good. Well, how would you feel if China or some other adversarial power, peer power, were talking about dominating you? Would you think that's okay? Or would you find it threatening? Well, how do you think the Chinese feel when we go on about domination?
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today. You mentioned, I mean, we're talking there about Monty Cranston, who is a specialist in euphemisms, in massaging the truth, a spinmeister, as you say. And, a couple of your epigraphs to chapters are from George Orwell. And you cite in the endnotes, I think you say that, the politics in the English language is like, the text that you would assign students if you could assign them, one thing to help them understand. and of course Orwell's whole politics in the English language is concerned with the use of euphemisms and the way that how we talk influences how we think and what we understand. And he
Yes.
talks about he talks then, because it wasn't new certainly, about how ethnic cleansing could be justified as just a population transfer if
Population
needed.
transfer, that's right. Yeah,
And all the kind of language, and reading that today, it doesn't seem to have dated very much. It's just new euphemisms. So
absolutely.
tell us a little bit more about how the way people talk about things is sort of helping them in the process of that rationalization that you mentioned, because you're exploring how people rationalize being part of this system.
Yeah, well, we already talked about one of the, in fact, a couple of the big ones. Probably the biggest is the replacement of the word military, certainly the word war, but also the word
Mm,
military with the word defense.
mm,
It's everywhere. And in fact, every now and then I'll tweet to a left-leaning journalist, would it make sense to stop calling this defense spending or
mhm,
defense budgets and just start calling it military spending and military budgets? I think military is a much more neutral term. It
mm,
interests me that the more accurate terminology here would be to
mm,
say, for example, the U.S. government is now going to allocate $1 trillion taxpayer dollars to the military. That's where it's going.
mm,
Defense is unclear. I actually don't think it's for defense. I don't think anybody needs this level of money for defense. It's nuts. But defense is an alleged intention. It's actually going to the military. Why don't you call it what it actually is? Well, because it's propaganda. That would be one instance. And another one that's been around for most of my adult lifetime, as far as I know, is the word intervention
mm,
as a preferred term to describe America's invasions and
mm,
bombing campaigns and occupations, that sort of thing.
mm,
If you think about it, intervention is a fairly friendly word. It's something
mm.
you would do with a friend who's developed an
You
alcohol or other
you
drug
you know.
problem. Yeah, you get the
We
family together.
Someone
Yeah,
needs to intervene to pull the parties apart. They started it. We don't start stuff. We just intervene in stuff
exactly.
that's
Just to help, to in our beneficent way, because our intentions are always good.
mm,
So interventions is another one that consistently interests me. And there are so many others. The use of the phrase enhanced interrogation techniques
oh
rather
yeah.
than torture. And I remember Chris Hayes saying, and I wouldn't call myself a fan of Chris Hayes exactly, although maybe he's doing the best you can do if you work for MSNBC. But he said this is like calling rape non-consensual
Mm,
sexual intercourse. It's just
mm,
like, what? What are you obscuring here?
mm,
That was another one that's quite obvious and that I find pretty disturbing. I think there's some reference to another one I came across in the book, the surge in
mm,
Iraq when the surge was announced. That's another one that I thought about.
mm,
I'm like, why the surge? Here's the thing you'll see in the book, and that I always imagine. These things are presented, and we don't really think about where they came from. For the first time, I remember when the surge was announced, the natural word, the organic one, the one that would be on the top shelf of your mind, most easily acceptable, I think, would be the tried and true escalation. That's what we're doing. We're sending 30,000 new troops into
yeah.
this war. We're escalating. I mean, that's just what it would obviously be called. And I can imagine the marketing meeting. And again, I think the way to understand these
Mm,
things is to think about a marketing meeting. They've got a product. It needs to be packaged. It needs to be positioned in the marketplace. And the brand name and the product name are going to be very important. So somebody said, all right, we're going to 30,000. We should have the president will write the speech and he's going to say we need to have an escalation. And then somebody said, no, 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 that's not good. Well, how can we call it a temporary escalation? Nope, no good. That's everybody's going to think Vietnam. It's open-ended. It's a quagmire.
mm,
And they tried a few different product names. And then somebody said, I got it. Bear with me
mm,
here. Listen, the surge.
mm,
Think about the surge. What does that conjure? The surge, the ocean tide surging up onto the beach. And what happens? What happens when the ocean surges onto the beach? What happens right afterward? It goes back out to the ocean. It's temporary. And it might even clean up some of the detritus, some of the seaweed shells, whatever's on the beach, just sweeps it back into the ocean, cleans off the beach. It comes in and then it goes out.
mm.
And everyone said, oh, I like it.
There's this novel is so rich with different themes. We haven't even we talked there about euphemisms, about idealism meeting the realities of power. You have the media is covered in the book. There is a people will see echoes of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden in parts of the book. But one thing I wanted to one theme that I wanted to discuss with you was you cite at one point Dr. Strangelove, and
Yeah.
I've written an article about Dr. Strangelove. One of the things I think that film captures so well is how things in a military context that are objectively insane and suicidal
Mm,
can come to seem rational and necessary. And you have a Curtis LeMay like character
yeah.
in your book, and a part of the book is about the US developing new capacities for AI controlled nuclear weapons, which is something that you think about it for a minute and you think that's dystopian and horrifying. And I think you note in the end notes that after you wrote the book, the very
Yeah.
capacities that you were talking about are in fact, under serious consideration by the US government. But
Yeah.
one of the things that you were sort of exploring in the book is the way that when everything we do is done because we have to do it in order to beat China to it, because if we don't do it, they'll do it first. And if it's all for our national defense, we can end up rationalizing and justifying things that
Absolutely.
seem at first glance to be totally ludicrous and homicidal madness.
Yeah. That's another thing that interests me, akin to what we were talking about. What happens to an idealistic politician who enters the system and starts compromising and rationalizing and getting closer to accruing more and more power? As a result, what happens if you're in an environment where these things are discussed in a way, viewed in a way that ordinary people just wouldn't understand them? I mean, if you say that this is a moment I enjoy in the book, I don't want to spoil anything. I will just say that Lance Thaddeus, my Julian Assange character, I find him hilarious in how he's almost driven crazy by the shit he is uncovering,
Hmm.
and what what he says about the notion of combining nuclear command and control with artificial intelligence. And the person he's talking to says like, this can't be true, and he says, how could it not be true? A species that's crazy enough to develop one potentially extinction event technology, nuclear weapons, and then
Yeah.
another one that's artificial intelligence, how can they not try to combine them? What's the worst that could happen? It's just two great tastes that taste great together. And he starts riffing on this. And I'm like, he's like, besides which, where do new technologies always get deployed first? The porn industry and war, always. Sex and death, Eros and Thanatos. So, of course, they're
Yeah.
putting these two things together. And I wrote this before I came across that article. And then I
Hmm.
came across the article and I'm like, yeah, the military is really doing this. Of course they are.
Hmm.
Thaddeus was right. So I think it's an interesting question. What happens to the people inside these institutions? And some of them have come forward, by the way. For anybody who's interested in this, and it's a bit depressing to read, or even worse than depressing. Annie Jacobson has a book, it must have come out about a
Hmm.
year ago, I think. It's
Oh
called,
yeah.
yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's called
Nuclear war
Nuclear War.
scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, Nuclear War Scenario. And it is just a phenomenal book, albeit if these sorts of things keep you up at night,
It's
I
a
don't know
hard
that I
read.
can. It's a hard read. It's a very hard read. And one of the things she talks about is one of the guys who I think he was involved in the hydrogen bomb project. And he was struck by how antiseptic it all became, throw weights and yields and blast radiuses, and how
Hmm.
many millions of people would be killed instantly, how many would die later. People were just talking about it as though they were, I don't know, talking about traffic patterns using spreadsheets.
Hmm.
And I think the human incentives when you're inside a system to adopt the rules of that system. And this is, of course, true for, excuse me, tribes too. We're wired pretty well to understand what the tribes expect, what they'll tolerate, and what they'll reject and punish. And we start trying to conform to the expected behavior. That's just part of the humans. And the only defense I know is to try to be as non-tribal as you can be, to try to be aware of the phenomenon. I have to say, if anybody's interested in this topic, there's a guy I know named Paul Graham, and he writes some of the best essays I've ever read. One of them is called Keep Your Identity Small. I remember first reading it years ago, and I hadn't articulated it the way Paul does. He writes terrific essays. I would say current affairs level quality writing. Um, Keep your identity small. It's got some very good advice. Once you start to identify with an in-group, a tribe, or whatever, it motivates you, whether you realize it or not, to stop dispassionately trying to get the most accurate understanding you can and to start defending the in-group becomes your primary motivation. And that's a dangerous thing if you prize accuracy.
Daniel Ellsberg, who worked as a nuclear war planner at the Rand Corporation in the early 60s, in his book, The Doomsday Machine, recounts seeing this document that was for the president's eyes only. And the document was the plan for all-out nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And, it tracked the number of expected deaths, and it was, 300 million within, about a month. And he recalls his reaction was that this is a plan for a genocide that would dwarf the Holocaust. He's like, this document shouldn't, he says something like, this shouldn't refer to anything that is real in the world. This should be in the realm of fiction. And knowing that it's a real plan, that the weapons are real, was so disturbing to him. And, he felt like, a sane person in a world that had just gone completely insane. But within this institution, somehow a logic had been constructed whereby these things made sense.
I think if you think that deeply inside the box and forget everything else then it starts to seem to make sense. I think that might be when they came up with the term omnicide. I might be wrong, but genocide wasn't enough to describe what was in these documents. And by the way, this is the thing, as I get older, and I hope I learn how better to persuade people, what are better tools of persuasion. I try not to just directly get people to conclude things. Instead, I try to give them what I think is an accurate and useful framework, and then they can plug in their own values. On this kind of stuff, what I would say is a lot of times I think the U.S. government is doing something that to me it's crazy, or at least it sounds crazy. And many times people will say, that's crazy, they would never do that. And what I say is, well, if you think about it, any country, any humans having control of nuclear weapons, that is already crazy. We're just so used to it that it doesn't really seem crazy anymore. But it's crazy that we would build and deploy potentially species-ending technology. So this is a version of, I think it's called the Dunn-Kruger, whatever it is, the phenomenon where you have some expertise in a certain area, and you read an article in the newspaper, and because of your expertise, you realize this article is just filled with inaccuracies, errors. It's bullshit. And then you turn the page to the next article, which is on a topic you don't know that much about, and you're back to thinking that everything you're reading in the newspaper must be true. You don't really learn the lesson that if X is bullshit, Y might be bullshit too. So when I look at these things, I'm like, look, if the US government is willing to do an extremely crazy thing, then why do you think it would only be crazy thing X? But no, come on, they would never do crazy thing Y. They do crazy things. We know this now. It's proven. So it's not impossible that crazy thing Y is also on the table.
But like I say, because you're a novelist, one of the nice things about doing this through the medium of a novel is that you really get to think, okay, but what does this thing that looks crazy, what does it look like on the inside to the people? Who are the humans? What is motivated? Because every system is ultimately at its base made of people. Those people have emotions, they have desires, they have reasoning processes. So what is going on among those different people? From the outside, we might just see, oh well, AOC was inspiring at point one, and at point two, she's doing things that seem to me to be disappointing. But what is actually going on in the mind of someone that could take them from point one to point two, which is why I say that this has a value as a piece of sociology as well as a a novel because it's really important if we're going to dismantle a system of power to understand, what are the different pressures, and they go beyond, they go beyond legal pressure or financial pressure to emotion. I mean, one of the things I like in the book is the way you weave in people's personal relationships as being really important. You're not just writing a story that is a pure political drama.
Thank you. I mean, it's this novel. There's no novel that I would say is easy to write. I don't want to
Yeah.
overstate. It's not like digging a ditch, but you really it takes a certain degree of discipline, and it's not like it's always fun. But it's rewarding because it combines so many of my interests. And again, anybody who looks at the epigraphs, footnotes,
Mm.
and influential works listed at the end of the book is going to see that you could argue, obsessed, I think, would be too strong a word, but I wouldn't get in an argument about it. I'm very interested in political stuff. If I could go back in time, I think I would have gone journalism would have been what I would start with instead of law. And I like to think I would have wound up as a novelist anyway. So this sort of stuff really interests me, but storytelling and stories
Mm.
interest me also, obviously. I have a bit of a knack. I hope I do. I think I do. I suck at a lot of things, but I'm a pretty good storyteller.
Yeah.
And so to be able to use that one tool, like I can tell a story, but to bring the politics in too, and I'm always thinking about these things. Sometimes people say, "What happened? What happened to this or that journalist?" And in my experience, often nothing happened. You changed. The
Mm.
zeitgeist changed. This person's doing it. And Glenn Greenwald to me is, by the way, the premier example of this. I've been following the guy for, I don't know, since he had a blog called Unclaimed Territory, close to 20 years, something like that, 18 years, I don't remember. And I don't see a lot of difference in his position. Some differences, but as you would expect for anybody who's been spending the last couple of decades writing on politics. But basically, he's been against war. He's against censorship. He hates hypocrisy. I see consistency there, but the left has changed a lot in the intervening years. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the left was anti-war, or what was called the left, whatever, and against censorship, and there have been dramatic changes in that regard. So if you've changed and you look at the person who hasn't changed and you say, hey, whatever happened to you, but that is something I think about a lot when I see someone who has changed. We were talking about AOC. It really intrigues me. What happened there? I don't think most people are bad. I think it's
Yeah.
lazy thinking to just, oh,
Yeah.
that's a bad person. And I think it's actually dangerous in some ways to think that way because it gives you a false sense of immunity. Oh, that could never happen to
Right.
me.
That's right.
Well, if you're
Evil people do
human and
evil
it happened
things.
to
Good
another
people
human,
don't
you're
do evil things.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And because this keeps coming up, not on purpose, and I don't benefit from it unless it helps other people. I just get a good feeling from that. But in the various interviews I've been doing in connection with the release of the book, I've been mentioning this wonderful short YouTube video called "Are We the Baddies?" Do you know what I'm
Oh
talking
yeah, this is
about?
a
Yeah,
fantastic. I love this. This is Mitchell and Webb. Yeah.
it's genius. So I don't know
Yeah.
those guys. This is the only thing I've ever seen. And for anyone who doesn't know it, you could just
Yeah.
find it. Just Google "Are We the Baddies?"
Yeah.
And what it is a short skit. It's two Nazis on the Eastern Front in World War II, and one of them has this nagging sense that he can't seem to shake. And it's, well, are we? I keep thinking,
But
are we the baddies? And the other Nazi, and he starts presenting his evidence, and it keeps getting worse. You know what I'm saying? So, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, actually, I read a
The connection
very
broke up a little.
um I wrote a big article about the Vietnam War, and in one of the Vietnam War memoirs, testimonies that I read, a soldier in Vietnam recalled saying at one point, or hearing one soldier say to another, "We're the redcoats, aren't we?" Which was like an identical situation where he had this sudden revelation that his role, using the stock of analogies that he had, he went, wait a second,
Yes.
I'm the
Yes.
British in the
Yes.
American Revolution.
It's it's extraordinary because again, a Martian would say, how could you fail to see that?
Yes.
And I think the answer, and again, this is the kind of stuff that interests me as a novelist, is because we're so wired to see ourselves as inherently good. I remember Ken
Mm,
Burns summed up his 10-part documentary on America's war in Vietnam by describing it as a tragedy. And I
mm,
think that's very interesting. It's hard for me to
mm.
imagine that an American scholar would describe the Soviet Union's invasion and occupation of Afghanistan as a tragedy. It's
Yeah.
just not a word we would use. We think of things as, the children sheltered in that school when the hurricane was bearing down on the town, and unfortunately, the
Hmm.
hurricane or the tornado, it took a certain path, hit the school, and three children died. That's a tragedy, no
Hmm.
question. That's what you call a tragedy. A human planned, intervened, extremely improbable sequence of events that result in an invasion and occupation with 500,000 troops of a country that most Americans had never heard of on the other side of the world. That's just not like a hurricane
Hmm.
or a tornado or anything else. It's not, whatever else you might want to say, it's not a tragedy. I mean, to call something like the Holocaust a tragedy, that would be very strange. It was
Yeah.
planned
It's a
and
crime.
implemented. So, yeah,
But
so
we
it's our
get drawn
enemies.
into wars. We don't
It's
wage wars, we get
always,
drawn in.
always drawn, we get drawn in,
Uh,
sucked in, pulled in.
yeah. But listen, just to conclude here, Barry, I wanted to go back to what Praveen was writing about in that article, "The Politics of Thrillers in Current
Yeah.
Affairs," where he discussed why your novels were such a kind of surprising standout in a genre that's kind of known for, I mean, not necessarily reactionary politics, but I think some of that kind of good versus evil, accepting the kind of prevailing American mythology. Could you talk about, without necessarily disparaging particular successful writers in the genre, but what is Praveen talking about in terms of the convention of the thriller genre, and how do you interpret what you're doing as departing from that or trying something different?
Yeah, I think right leaning tropes tend to lend themselves well to writing thrillers, action thrillers, political thrillers, in part because the things you can depict are inherently dramatic, cinematic.
Hmm.
If you think, take torture as a trope, can compare the reality of torture and the propaganda of torture. Start with the propaganda. We've seen the scene in countless movies. If you see this kind of movie, the heroic guy puts the bad guy against the wall and maybe like
Hmm.
puts a gun under his neck or threatens him or something. It says, like, tell me where the girl is, and the bad guy says, I'm not telling you. Tell me where the girl is. I'm not telling you. Tell me where. And then he's like, okay, okay, copper. And it can be dramatic. I mean, if anyone is a fan of the movie L.A. Confidential, I wouldn't call this any kind of rightist movie or anything like that. It certainly isn't. It's based on a James Ellroy novel, but there's an admittedly great scene. It is riveting, where Russell Crowe, playing the cop Bud White, the damaged cop, he tortures a guy, and to give him information, plays a game of Russian roulette with the guy until the guy tells him what he wants to know. And it doesn't make any sense. If the gun goes off, he's going to blow the guy's head off, and he's not going to find out the information. It's nuts, but it works cinematically and it's easy. It's a good plot device. If you need some information, just have your hero torture the bad guy, you get the information. So it lends itself well. Also, think about action thrillers. It's mostly about heroes and villains. I mean, when they're done well, they are. I mean, Die Hard is a great movie. It's superbly well written. I could go on and on about that, but just leave that
Hmm.
aside for the moment. If you like action movies, the writing does not get better than Die Hard. What's it about, really? It's about a hero, Bruce Willis,
Hmm.
the cop who's trapped in the building and barefoot and helpless, whatever. And the arch villain, Hans Gruber, played brilliantly by Alan Rickman. It's a good and evil that just lends itself to these kind of
Hmm.
stories, so it's easy. That's one thing you've got going on. And the other thing that's going on, I think, is that I think it's fair to say that historically the right has been better, much better than the left. Or at this point, I don't even, sometimes right and left has gotten so topsy-turvy. I
Sure.
would say the forces of propaganda and self-congratulation have traditionally been better than the forces of realism and self-reflection at promoting favored narratives through fiction and drama. And so back in the day, you had a couple of thriller writers who I haven't been in touch with them in a while, but they're good guys. I'm not trying to put anyone down.
Yeah.
Brad Thor and Vince, other Vinces, Vince Gilligan, Vince Flynn, both thriller writers, celebrated big New York Times bestsellers. Good guys. Vince Flynn died tragically young of cancer not that long ago, but a very nice guy. But I think it's fair to say that their novels adhered to more traditional. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They hate us for our freedoms. America is a force for good in the world. They light onto, not that the hero isn't damaged or doesn't have a wound or a ghost or whatever, but still,
Hmm.
these novels promote a somewhat self-congratulatory, feel-good view of what America is and what it stands for in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody who enjoys these novels, I think it's fair to say, would be particularly receptive to the myth of a book like The Myth of American Idealism and Foreign Policy. It would just be like, what are you talking about? They'd be hostile to that. And you had some big voices on the right who were very happy to promote these novels. I'm not saying that Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck back in the day, they heavily promoted these guys' novels. Again, I'm not envious. I'm not complaining. I assume they genuinely loved the stories. But fiction is much more powerful, I think, than sometimes the forces of reason really understand. You were talking about politics in the English language earlier. It's a fantastic essay. I think it's maybe 3 pages. Every school child should read and reread this essay, and adults too. But what is Orwell best known for? Novels, 1984 and Animal Farm, particularly 1984. That's what had the biggest impact. Fiction can be a very powerful way of getting people to see the world, the humans' life differently. And I just think the left hasn't been very clever about promoting fiction that promotes the leftist point of view, or whatever you want to call it. The reality-based community hasn't been very clever about this. And so people respond to incentives. And if you can get invited onto Rush Limbaugh's show back in the day, he's gone now, that's a very big megaphone that's going to be promoting your work. Whereas someone like me, I like to think that my stories are awesome, and of course I would think that, so you shouldn't take my word to it. But readers and reviewers, etc., seem to think the stories are great, but they're more nuanced about the way power is presented. I mean, you read a story like the new novel, The System, and it's just not that clear who are the heroes and villains. I mean, you'll make up your own mind. You'll be favored. You'll feel favorably disposed toward some characters, and less so toward others. But this is not a story of heroes and villains. It's a lot more complicated than that, because reality is complicated. And I think that's something that's more difficult to present in a traditional thriller setting than we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, we're a force for the good in the world. Sometimes we have to get our hands dirty like Jack Bauer.
It's more difficult, but somehow you pull it off, Barry. I mean, people might give up. People might say, that, the genre inherently doesn't lend itself to this kind of complexity. But what's cool is that you've managed this because you have a lot of readers who love your work, and somehow you've managed to break the break the conventions a bit. And I was so totally honored to be in the endnotes, to have the Myth of American Idealism, which I co-wrote with Noam Chomsky, in the endnotes. But then I was thinking, wow, the very fact that not many people as a percentage read Chomsky books. They're dry, they're difficult, they hurt to read because they're long catalogs of atrocities. I get it. But you've managed to take, the analysis of Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Scott Horton, Noam Chomsky, these dissident thinkers, and you've managed to package it into a story that somehow doesn't feel like it's just beating you on the head with Chomsky's ideas, where everyone is an obvious stand-in for something. There's a level of human complexity and drama, and people have family lives, and and people have doubts. So congratulations on The System.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a really nice compliment. Thank you. I don't want to write, this is fiction, but I don't want it to be a fantasy, and I certainly don't want it to be propaganda. I want everything I do to be as real as I can make it, with fictional characters dropped into functionally non-fictional settings and circumstances. And so I'm influenced by people like you, Current Affairs Magazine, Chomsky, and all the other people you mentioned. And all of these thinkers have shaped my worldview, and I want that worldview to be represented in the fictional worlds I create. That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, I hope other people will take up this challenge of, because as you say, there is room for more experimentation here. I hope that other fiction writers will consider doing the kind of thing you do here, where it's like, it's not obviously a quote novel of ideas where you're just having people have philosophical conversations back and forth. But as I say, there's a ton of endnotes here, and Smedley Butler and Chris Hedges and Machiavelli and Seymour Hersh are all in the endnotes. So if our readers, just to give our readers and listeners one tiny bit more encouragement. You will also find, this is my non-spoiler spoiler, which is that one thing that you will find out if you read the book is that if you've heard of the parliamentarian ends up having somewhat of a major role here in a way and that was one of my most delightful surprises, was when the parliamentarian turned out to be really important. I thought that was so funny.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
And when you buy it, you won't have to get it in this format, which is the format Barry sent it to me, because it's now out as an actual book, and you don't have to have just a big stack of loose pages. So thank you very much.
Also in digital. Also in digital, also an audiobook. I read all the audiobooks, and I think they're reasonably well done. Thank you so much, Nathan. It really has been an honor. I love the magazine, Current Affairs. And as I said, you've been an influence too, so this was a thrill. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.